Drekthar weeps as he tells me of these things, tears falling from eyes that can no longer see the present, but too keenly can see the past. I have no comfort to offer him. That the elements have come again to his call, to mine, indeed to that of any Orcish shaman, is testimony to their compassion and forgiveness, their desire to see the balance restored. The spire that still houses darkness is not on this continent. We are well away from its malevolence physically, but not yet out of its shadow. The shadow that was cast so long ago, on the day following the defiling of what had been our most sacred place. The shadow of Blackhand. Sleep did not come easily to Durotan, nor, he realized, to Draka, as she tossed and turned and sighed. Finally, he gave up and lay awake, going over dire events of the day. Everything in him screamed that it was wrong to embrace a magical path that so blatantly throve on the suffering of another being. And yet, what else was there to do? The elements had deserted the shaman, even though the ancestors themselves had given the orcs this task. Without magic to use as an additional weapon, the orcs would be wiped out by the superior technology and knowledge of the Draenei. He rose and left the sleeping tent. He started a fire to shake off the pre-drawn chill and silently ate cold raw meat. As he broke his fast and watched the sky lighten, he saw a courier approaching. Without stopping, the rider tossed a scroll to Durotan and rode on. Durotan unfolded it and closed his eyes at the contents. There was to be another meeting in 2 days. At that time, the chieftains would elect a leader who would speak for them all, make decisions for them all. They would select one who would be called War Chief. A soft hand stroked his hair. He looked up to see Draka reading over his shoulder. "You might as well stay home," she said gruffly. "The outcome is decided anyway." He smiled sadly at her. "You did not used to be so cynical, beloved." "I did not used to live in such times," was all she said. In his heart, he knew she was right. There was only one orc who was well known enough, charismatic enough to win sufficient votes to be elected war chief. Grom Hellscream might give Blackhand a bit of a challenge, but Hellscream was too impulsive to be trusted with such a task. Blackhand had been a visible figure from the very start, at first opposing and then supporting Ner'zhul. It was his shaman who had become the first warlocks. He had won more victories in his attacks against the Draenei than anyone else. Draka, as she was so often, was right in this as well. And 2 days later, Durotan watched with dull eyes as the votes from the clan chieftains were tallied, and his Blackhand of the Blackrock clan was chosen. He felt silver glances come his way as Blackhand's name was announced by Gul'dan, and as the big orc stood with false modesty, accepted the title. Durotan did not even bother to object. What would be the point? He was already being watched closely for suspicion of disloyalty. No word he could possibly utter would change anything. At one point, he looked over at Ogrim. To all other eyes, the second in command of the Blackrock clan looked steady and supportive of his leader. But Durotan knew Ogrim better than anyone, and he saw the slight frown that furrowed his friend's brow, the tightness around the lips that indicated that Ogrim was perhaps as unhappy with the decision as Durotan. But he, too, was in no position to object. Durotan hoped that perhaps Ogrim's position, so close to Blackhand, would help mitigate the damage he was certain Blackhand would do. Blackhand now stood in front, waving and smiling at the cheering crowd. Durotan could not object, but neither could he bring himself to cheer for an orc who exemplified everything he despised. Ogrim stood behind his leader on Blackhand's right. Gul'dan, whom Durotan was certain was manipulating things, but was unsure as to how, stood back and gazed at Blackhand respectively. "My orcish brothers and sisters," Blackhand cried, "you honor me. I will prove a worthy war chief of this vast sea of noble warriors. Day by day, we improve our weapons and our armor, and now we reject the unpredictable elements and embrace true power, power that our warlocks controlled and wield without groveling or scraping to anyone or anything. This is liberation. This is strength. We are of one purpose, one clear focus. We will wipe the Draenei from our lands. They will be unable to resist this tide of warriors and warlocks, this sweeping horde. We are their worst nightmare. To battle!" He lifted his arms and shouted, "For the horde!" and thousands of impassioned voices cried, "For the Horde! For the Horde! For the Horde!" Duratan and Draka returned home shortly after the election of Blackhand, too disgusted to remain longer. The shaman stayed behind for training. When they returned several days later, Duratan saw they stood tall and proud once again. This new magic had given them back their faith in themselves, something that had evaporated like morning mist when the elements deserted them. For that, Duratan was grateful. He loved his clan, and knew them to be good people. He did not like seeing them broken and disheartened. They practiced their skills on beasts at first, joining the hunting parties and sending their strange creatures after Klefthoof and Talbuk. Duratan was still troubled at the agony the attacked creatures suffered. As time passed, the creatures suffered less, not because the pain was decreased, but because the warlocks were learned to kill faster and more efficiently. The addition of the strange helpers, or pets as some warlocks fondly referred to the beings firmly under their control, seemed to make all the difference. Blackhand seemed to be enjoying his newfound position. Scrolls came almost daily from the couriers, whose wolves and whose selves seemed to wear more ornate adornment each time they rode into camp. Duratan had to admit that knowing what was going on with the other clans was useful information. But one day, someone other than the courier came into the encampment. Duratan recognized the raiment. The approaching orc, mounted on a wolf with a particularly glossy black cloak, was one of Blackhand's personal warlocks, Kurkul. He halted his wolf, dismounted, and bowed before Duratan. "Chieftain, a word with you from the war chief," he said in a surprisingly pleasant voice. Duratan nodded and motioned that the warlock walk with him. They strode until he felt certain they would not be overheard. "What is it that Blackhand sends one of his most important warlocks to me?" he asked. Kurkul smiled around his tusks. "I am writing to all the clans," he said, clearly intending for Duratan to be put in his place. The Frostwolves were not being particularly honored, it would seem. Duratan grunted and folded his arms across his chest, waiting. "The most important factor in our eventual and glorious victory over the Draenei is numbers," Kurkul continued. "They are few, we are many, but we need to be more." "So what is it Blackhand wishes?" growled Duratan. "Shall we leave off fighting for mating?" Kurkul did not blink. "Not leave off fighting, but yes, encourage your warriors to procreate. You will receive accolades for each child that is born to your clan." "That will help, but unfortunately, we need more warriors right now, not 6 years from now." Duratan stared, stunned. He had meant the comment as a crude joke. What was going on? "Children begin training at age 6, Kurkul continued. "They are strong enough to fight at age 12. Summon all your younglings." "I do not understand," Duratan said. "Summon them for what?" Kurkul sighed as if Duratan were a foolish child. "I have the ability to accentuate their growth," he said. "We will push them forward a bit. If we take all the children that are between 6 and 12 now and age them to 12, we will increase the number of warriors on the field by almost 50%. Duratan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Absolutely not. I'm afraid it's not a choice, it's an order. Any clan who refuses will be branded a traitor to the Horde. The clan will be exiled, and their leader and his mate executed." Duratan stared, stunned. Kurkul handed him a scroll. He read it, shaking with anger, and saw that the warlock had spoken truly. He and Draka would be put to death, and the Frostwolf clan exiled. "You would rob them of their childhood, then," he said stonily. "For their future, yes. I will drain a little of their lives, only 6 years' worth. They will come to no harm. The Blackrock children certainly didn't. Blackhand insisted on his own 3 young ones be the first to be so honored, and in return, they will be able to fight for the glory of the Horde now, when they can make a difference." Duratan was not in the least surprised that Blackhand had permitted this to be done to his own children. For the first time, Duratan was grateful that there were so few children in his clan. There were only 5 of them older than 6 and younger than 12. He again read the missive, feeling furious and sickened at the same time. These children ought to be able to simply be children. The warlock waited calmly. Finally, Duratan said in a voice he made deliberately harsh to hide his pain, "Do what you must do. For the Horde," said Kurkul. Duratan did not reply. What happened next was barbaric. Duratan forced himself to remain impassive, while Kirkle cast a spell on the 5 Frostwolf children. They writhed in pain, screaming and flailing on the earth as bones were stretched, and skin and muscle burst into unnatural growth. A sickly green line linked the children to the warlock, as if he was sucking the very life out of them. The expression on Kirkle's face was ecstatic. If the children were suffering, he most definitely was not. For an awful moment, Duratan feared the warlock would not stop at age 12, but would continue draining life from the children until they were shriveled and ancient. But thankfully, Kirkle did stop. The young orcs, children no longer, lay where they had dropped the instant the draining had begun. For long moments, they could not be roused, and when they did, they wept, softly, breathily, as if they had no strength left for anything else. Duratan turned toward the warlock. "You have done what you have came for. Get out." Kirkle looked offended. "Chieftain Duratan, you—" Duratan seized him by the front of his scarlet robe. Fear flickered across the other orc's face. "Get out. Now." Duratan shoved hard, and Kirkle stumbled backward, almost falling. He glowered at Duratan. "Blackhand will not be pleased to hear of this," Kirkle growled. Duratan did not dare speak. If any other words came from his mouth, he knew they would doom his clan. Instead he turned away, shaken with rage, and went to the children who were children no longer. For some time after that, nothing was asked of the Frostwolf clan, save more intensive training and reporting back on that training, and Duratan was both relieved and apprehensive. Somehow, he knew that when Blackhand and Gul'dan chose to notice him, the task they would set for him would be a difficult one. He would not be disappointed. Duratan was looking at a new pattern for armor the smith had just drawn up, when the wolf rider leapt into the Frostwolf encampment. Without breaking stride, the rider tossed Duratan a parchment, wheeled his mount around, and departed. Duratan unrolled it and began to read, his eyes widening. He looked up quickly at the departing figure of the rider. It was not the official courier. "Old friend, I am sure it comes as no surprise that you are being watched. They will set a task for you, one that they know you can complete. You must do so. I do not know what they will do if you refuse, but I fear the worst." There was no signature. The missive did not need one. Duratan knew Ogrim's bold script. He crumpled the parchment and tossed it into the fire, watching it twist and curl in on itself like a living thing as the flames licked and consumed it. Ogrim had sent the warning just in time. That very afternoon, a rider wearing the official tabard of a courier approached and handed the Frostwolf chieftain a parchment. Duratan nodded as he accepted it and put it aside. He did not want to see it right now. But the courier looked uneasy. She did not dismount, but neither did she turn her wolf and ride back to the Frostwolf lands. "I have been instructed to wait for a reply," she said, after an awkward pause. Duratan nodded and unrolled the parchment. The writing was exquisite, and he knew that Blackhand had dictated the missive. The war chief, smart and cunning though he was barely literate. It was worse than he had thought. Duratan kept his face carefully neutral, though out of the corner of his eyes, he saw that Draka was watching him carefully. "On to Duratan, son of Garad, chieftain of the Frostwolf clan. Blackhand, war chief of the Horde, gives greetings. You have now had time to see the skills of our newly trained warlocks in action. It is time to take the attack to our enemies. The Draenei city of Telmor is close to your borders. You are instructed to form a war party and attack them. Ogrim has told me that as boys, the two of you entered that city, that you saw the secret of how the Draenei kept themselves unseen. Ogrim also tells me that you have excellent recall, and that you would remember how to expose the city to our warriors for an assault. I am sure I don't have to tell you what destroying this city would mean to the Horde and to the Frostwolf clan. Reply to this letter immediately, and we will begin preparations for the assault. For the Horde." The signature was an imprint of Blackhand's right hand, stained with ink. Duratan was furious. How could Ogrim have revealed this information? Did he truly follow Blackhand after all, that he would tell the war chief of this incident, and so put Duratan on the spot? The anger ebbed as he realized that the information to which Blackhand referred, their visit there as boys, the way the city was hidden, Duratan's almost uncanny memory, these were things that could have been dropped in conversation at any point over the last few years. Blackhand was intelligent enough to pick up any crumb of information and hoard it until such a time was necessary. Durotan thought about lying, about claiming that he could not recall the words by which Restolon had dispelled the illusion that kept Dai City safe and hidden from the eyes of the ogres, and now the eyes of orcs. It had been a long time, and he had only heard the phrase uttered once. Anyone else would have forgotten it, but the threat in Dai letter was so thinly veiled as to be almost ridiculous. If Durotan agreed to assist with the attack, he would prove his loyalty to the Horde, to Blackhand, and to Gul'dan, at least for the moment. If he refused, even if he claimed to not recall the words Blackhand wanted him to speak, well, like Ogrim, Durotan feared the worst. The courier was waiting. Durotan made the only decision he could make. He looked up at the courier, his face impassive. I will do as the war chief bids, of course, for the Horde. The courier looked both relieved and a little surprised. The war chief will be pleased to hear this. I am instructed to give you the following. She reached into her leather backpack and retrieved a small sack, which she handed to Durotan. Your warriors and your warlocks will need to train with these. Durotan nodded. He knew what they were. The Heart of Fury and the brilliant star that he had ordered taken off Velen. These stones were perhaps the only things that had spared him once before, when he had incurred Ner'zhul's anger. Now, he would use them against the very people he had taken them from. The war chief will contact you soon, the courier said, inclined her head, and turned her wolf. Durotan watched her go. Draka stepped quietly beside him. He handed her the letter and went into their tent. A few moments later she joined him, slipping her arms around him from behind while he buried his face in his hands and grieved over the events that led to the terrible decision he had been forced to make. A few days later the war party gathered at the Frostwolf encampment. Most of the warriors and warlocks were from the Blackrock clan, but there were more than a few painted warsong faces in the crowd, and several shattered hand as well. Even the most obtuse among the Frostwolves could sense the mistrust and contempt from the visitors. Durotan knew it was no accident that the other orcs were all from the most martial clans. They were there to make sure the Frostwolves did not falter at any critical point. Durotan idly wondered which among them had the instructions to slit his throat at the first sign of hesitation. He hoped it was not Ogrim. The two old friends exchanged only a few words, and Durotan saw regret in Ogrim's visage. For that, at least, he was glad. A courier had been sent ahead, so there were plenty of bonfires roaring and food and drink for the hungry guests. Many of the Frostwolves gave up their own lodging for the visitors, so that those who would head into battle the following morning would rest as well as possible. Durotan met with Ogrim and the others who led the assault, sketching out a layout of the city as best he and Ogrim could recall it. By daybreak, the war party, the small army of orcs, was on the move. They passed into the meadows that surrounded the Terakar forest, where so long ago Ogrim and Durotan had raced as youths and been startled by the appearance of an ogre. No lumbering giants troubled the vast wave of orcs as they moved steadily toward their destination this morning. Durotan was in the front, riding beside Ogrim on Night Stalker. They were silent, but Durotan did not miss the fact that Ogrim's gray eyes lingered on the site where the two boys had been rescued by the Draenei warriors. The years have been long since we passed this way, Durotan said. Ogrim nodded. I am not even sure we have the right direction. The forests and fields have changed and grown, and there were precious few landmarks originally, Durotan said heavily. I remember the way. He wished he did not. A pile of stones here, a strange-shaped outcropping there, was enough to guide him. It looked like nothing to anyone else. Blackhand had told his troops that the Draenei were able to disguise their city. Even so, Durotan's sharp ears caught slight murmurings of concern. He frowned. We are drawing close, he said. You must be quiet. There is an excellent chance that we will have been seen and reported already. The war party grew silent then. With a few gestures, Ogrim dispatched some of his outriders to scout the area. Durotan's mind went back to that twilight, when he, too, was worried about where they were going and what the Draenei had planned for them. He brought his wolf to a halt and dismounted. Night Stalker shook his head and scratched behind his ears absently. It was here, or close to here. Durotan felt a desperate hope that perhaps the Draenei remembered that they had exposed their secret to him, that they had changed the hiding place of the magical stone upon which their protection depended. There was no telltale rock beneath which the green gem was secreted. Duratan's memory would have no aid to him uncovering it. He concentrated, walking slowly, hearing the jangling of tack and the soft clinking of armor as the others watched and waited. He closed his eyes to aid his concentration. Saw again Restalon kneeling on the ground, moving aside leaves and pine needles to uncover. Duratan opened his eyes and moved a few steps to his left. He said a quick prayer to the ancestors. Whether it was asking for help in finding the stone or not finding it, he was not certain. Mailed hands reached down and brushed away layers of detritus and then touched something cool and hard. There was no turning back now. Duratan closed his fingers around the gem and picked it up. Even in his distraught state of mind, he could sense the stone emanating a comforting energy. It nestled in his palm as if it belonged there. Duratan ran his left index finger over it, drawing out this moment before everything would change irrevocably. "You found it," breathed Ogrim, who had silently stepped up to his friend. Duratan was overcome with emotion and could not speak for a moment. He merely nodded, then tore his gaze from the beautiful, pulsating stone and looked up at the awestruck faces gazing at the treasure he held. Ogrim nodded brusquely. "Get into position," he said. "We have been fortunate that there has been no advance warning." The stone was so calming to hold. Duratan wanted nothing better than to simply stand and look into its depths, but he knew that he had already made his choice. He took a deep breath and spoke the words that Restalon had spoken so long ago in the same place. Kella men Samir, Sole ama Kal. He wanted to believe that his thick, orcish accent would not activate the stone, that he was able to fulfill his obligation to his people without storming a small city full of civilians. But apparently, the words were understood by whatever force controlled the green gem. The illusion was already dissipating, the trees and boulders shimmering into insubstantiality, and before the orcish war party, a wide, paved road stretched as if an invitation. They needed no urging. The glorious city of the Draenei lay before them, and with cries torn from over 100 throats, the orcs descended upon it. Chapter 15. Drekthar speaks in a broken voice of glories ruined, of beauty destroyed, of the slaughter of children. Through his tale runs an unspoken excuse. It seemed so right at the time. I imagine it did seem right. It did seem just. I can only pray to the ancestors that I am never placed in the same position as my father, torn between what I know in my heart is right and the defense of my people. It is why I continue to strive to uphold the tenuous peace between us and the Alliance, because few offenses and insults in this or any other world are sufficient to warrant the slaughter of children. Later, Duratan would wonder how the city of Telmor had received no advance notice of a wave of mounted orcs. He would never be able to speak with the Draenei to find out. He could only assume that the Draenei were so certain in their illusionary camouflage that the idea that it could be breached never occurred to them. The quiet air was rent with the sound of war cries and wolf howls as the riders stormed the streets of the city. Several unarmed Draenei were cut down in the first few seconds of the assault. The white pavement was soon blue with spilled blood, but it did not take very long for the city guards to counterattack. Duratan had shoved the stone into his pack the moment he had finished using it. It would join the red and yellow stones he had taken from Velen. He mounted quickly and rode with grim determination, his axe at the ready. While he had made his own private vow that he would not attack an unarmed foe or child, he had also made his choice, and was prepared to kill or die for it. The first wave flooded the city. A river of orcs forked into streams, pouring into large, spherical public buildings that branched off to either side of the main street, surging up the wide stone steps. The warlocks brought up the rear. Their creatures were silent and obedient, save the small ones that muttered constantly under their breaths. They waited for the right moments to bring down the rain of fire, the bolts of shadow, the various curses of torment. The warriors emerged covered with blood, the boots tracking it down the wide steps as they continued on to the next building, and the next. The Draenei guards were in the streets now, casting their own magics. Duratan turned in his saddle barely in time to deflect a blow from a sword that blazed with blue energy. The sword clanged against the head of his axe and jarred his arm to the bone, but that was nothing compared to the shock he felt at recognizing his attacker. For the second time, he and Restalon were meeting in battle. Duratan had spared Velen, and in return, Restalon had spared him when he was helpless before the Draenei warrior. Durotan saw recognition in the other's eyes, then those glowing blue orbs narrowed. All debts between them were paid. This time, there would be no quarter given on either side. Restolon cried something in his musical tongue. Instead of attacking again, he hauled Durotan from his saddle. Durotan was taken by surprise, and before he knew what was happening, he lay on the ground before his enemy. He reached for his axe as Restolon swung his sword, thinking even as his fingers closed about the hilt that he would not be swift enough. Nightstalker, however, was trained almost as well as the orc who rode him. The instant the wolf felt his rider leave his back, he whirled on Restolon. Huge teeth crunched down on the Draenei's arm. Had it not been for the protective armor Restolon wore, his arm would have been severed instantly. As it was, the pressure was enough to cripple him and make him drop the sword. With a grunt, Durotan swung his axe as hard as he could. It slammed into Restolon's midsection, its keen edge cleaving through his armor to bite deep into his flesh. Restolon fell to his knees, his useless arm still held fast by Nightstalker's teeth. The white wolf bit down harder, growling, and started whirring the Draenei's arm as if it were a small animal. Within moments, the wolf would rip it off. Blood gushed from the wound in Restolon's side. He made no sound despite the agony he must be enduring. Durotan got to his feet and struck again, this time a killing blow, a mercy blow. Restolon sagged, and Nightstalker immediately let go of the arm. The captain of the guards of Telmor was dead. Durotan did not permit himself regret. He mounted Nightstalker quickly and sought out his next target. The city was certainly not the size of Shatrath, their capital, but it was big enough. There were Draenei aplenty to slaughter. The air was filled with the cries of bloodlust, of pain and fear, of the clanging of sword on shield and the crackle of spells being cast. Odors assaulted his nostrils, of blood and feces and urine, and the unmistakable, unique wreck of terror. The rage boiling inside him felt good. His senses had never been higher, and he seemed to move without thinking. Over there, another one of the guards fighting Ogrim. Durotan tensed, thinking to rush to his friend's aid, but the doomhammer swung through the air and crushed the attacker's skull even through his helm. Durotan grinned fiercely. Ogrim needed no aid. He sensed the presence at his side before he heard or smelt it, and turned, bellowing his clan's war cry. He hoisted the gore-covered axe and prepared to bring it down. The child was barely out of puberty, but she screamed in a fury as she tore with bare hands at his armored leg. Tears streamed down her pale blue face, and her teeth were bared. Blue blood, too much of it to be her own, saturated her dress so that it clung to her body. She pounded futilely at him, her tear-filled eyes burning with pain and righteous fury. For a horrible second, she seemed to be the same girl that Durotan and Ogrim had encountered years ago. That could not be. Surely that girl was a woman now. Or was she? But it did not matter. It was a female child who, both bravely and stupidly, was attempting to attack a mounted orc warrior with her bare hands. It was with an enormous effort that Durotan halted the axe in mid-swing. He would not harm a child. That was not the code. That was not the way of the orcs. Suddenly the girl froze. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth and blood gushed forth. Durotan's gaze dropped from her face to her chest, and he could see the spear point tenting the blood-soaked fabric. Before Durotan could react, the shattered-hand orc who had slain the girl shoved the spear to the side, forcing the body to the earth. He put one booted foot on her shoulder. Grunting, he pulled loose his spear and grinned up at Durotan. "You owe me one, Frostwolf," the orc said, then vanished into the close-pressing crowd of slayers and victims. Durotan threw back his head and cried his agony to the ancestors. On surged the orcs, leaving corpses in their wake. The vast majority of the dead were Draenei, but here and there a brown body of a fallen orc could be seen. Some of the orcs who fell yet lived, crying out for aid, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Shaman could have healed them with spells, but apparently warlock magics did not embrace the healing arts. So they lay where they had fallen, some wheezing out their last breaths next to the Draenei they had slain, while the unstoppable tide poured forward. They followed the road through the foothills, entering each building as they went, and slaughtering anyone they found. No doubt some Draenei had hidden, Durotan thought, and prayed they would not be found. He did not think that prayer would be answered. Once the first round of slaughter had been completed, there would be the looting and the search for those who had escaped the first assault. He knew it had been planned thus. They had reached the largest building yet, the one that sat highest on the mountain, and Durotan recognized it immediately. It was the Magister's home, where he and Ogrim had had dinner with the Prophet. Bitterly, he thought that Velen was not much of a prophet if he had not foreseen this black moment. Nightstalker raced up the steps, and Durotan could not help himself. He craned his neck and looked over his shoulder, back down toward the city as he had done the first time he had climbed these steps on his own 2 feet. Then, the Draenei city had been spread out like jewels on a meadow. Now, it looked exactly like what it was, a broken, taken city spattered with blood and gore and death, not just of its citizens, but of any hope of peace or truce or negotiation. Durotan closed his eyes briefly in pain. "I am proud of my people and our city," Restallon had said to Durotan. Restallon, who lay dead and stiffening on the white street along with countless other Draenei. "We have worked hard here. We love Draenor, and I never thought to have the chance to share it with an orc. The ways of destiny are strange indeed, stranger than either orc youth or Draenei guard could have imagined. The rooms that had made 2 orc youths feel slightly penned in years ago now seem utterly claustrophobic when crammed with adult orc warriors by the dozen. Most were empty. There had been time for an evacuation of all but those who had sworn to die in service of their city, and die they did, the guards who attacked them now. The beautiful, ornate furniture was used as weapons, brought crashing down upon Draenei heads, the breakage adding to the thrill of the fight. Orcs punched holes in the smooth, curving walls for the sheer pleasure of it. Beds were hacked with swords. Bowls of fruit and delicately wrought statuettes swept off furniture that was in turn smashed by axe or hammer. Durotan had had enough. "Hold," he cried, but no one listened. The creatures controlled by the warlocks seemed well pleased with this behavior, almost smug. But the time for destruction had passed, and the ruthless savagery would not serve the orcs now that all the inhabitants of Telmor were either slain or had fled. "Hold!" Durotan yelled again. This time Ogrim heard him and took up the cry. The Warsong representative also shook his head, as if to clear it of something hazy and obscuring. Then he, too, tried to calm his warriors. Drekthar, back with the other warlocks, had not become as lost in bloodlust as the others, and he was able to stop the others from casting spells. "Listen to me," Durotan roared. Most of them had reached the room where Velen had hosted them at his table. The room was empty, dyed chairs and tables overturned, the wall hangings shredded and cast to the floor. "We have taken the city. It is now time to take what we need from it." They were listening now, their breaths coming in pants that filled the room with a raspy sound. But at least they had stopped swinging their weapons at anything that moved, or even anything that didn't. "First we attend to the injured," Durotan ordered. "We will not leave our brethren to suffer in the streets." Some of them stared guiltily at that. Durotan realized, with disgust, that many of these warriors had completely forgotten that some of their numbers still lay writhing in pain outside, while they enjoyed die-wanton destruction of the Magister's estate. He pushed his feelings down and nodded to Drekthar. The warlocks might no longer have healing spells, but they had once been shaman, and knew how to tend battle wounds in a more mundane fashion. Drekthar motioned to several warlocks, and they hurried back the way they had come. "Next, this city has supplies, the likes of which we have never seen. There are foodstuffs aplenty, and weapons, and armor, and other things we know not of. Things that will serve the Horde in its quest to—" He could not say the words as he had planned. "In its quest to wipe out the Draenei." Instead he added somewhat awkwardly, "In its quest, we are an army. An army marches on its stomach. We need to be well fed, well watered, healed, rested, protected. Ogrim, you take a group and start at this end. Guthor, you take a group and head back to the gates. Work your way up the main road until you meet Ogrim's group. Anyone who has any healing knowledge, report to Drekthar, and do exactly as he tells you to do." "What if any Draenei we find alive?" asked someone. What indeed? There was no infrastructure to take care of prisoners, and in truth, the only purpose of a prisoner would be for negotiations, since it had been made quite clear that the sole purpose of the Horde was total extermination of the Draenei race. There was no reason to host prisoners. Kill them, Durotan said hoarsely. He hoped the raggedness of his voice would be interpreted as raw fury, rather than the agonizing pain it was. Kill them all. As the orcs he commanded hurried to obey his orders, Durotan found himself wishing that Nightstalker had not been so quick to protect him. It would have been easier had he perished by Restallon's hand this day than speak the words he had just uttered. With any luck, during this horrific campaign to obliterate a species who had never raised a hand to them, death would find Durotan sooner rather than later. Chapter 16. The Shadow Council. Even now, so many years on, we know so little about who they were and what they did. Gul'dan carried many, many secrets to his grave. May he rot there in torment. It is difficult enough for me to understand how one or two may become so corrupt they would doom their descendants for power in their lifetimes. That there were so many, the number is not even known for certain, is beyond the scope of my limited imagination. Yet even these numbers would not have mattered had it not been for the demons who held them in their grasp. Their pain I rejoice in. What they did to others who obeyed them because they trusted them, I condemn with every fiber of my being. That was an excellent test, Kil'jaeden approved, smiling at his subjects. Gul'dan bowed, his eyes bright with his master's approval. Ner'zhul hunkered down, his eyes on the floor, but even so, he was listening. I confess, I was surprised Durotan was able to carry out our orders, Gul'dan said. I expected him to resist, or at least put shackles on what his orcs could and could not do. But the city lies claimed and broken, my lord. All the Draenei who once lived there are gone, most of them dead. Most is not good enough, Gul'dan. You know that. Gul'dan flinched slightly at the criticism. He wondered, not for the first time, about the connection between Kil'jaeden and the Draenei, and why the Beautiful One so despised them. It was our first attempt at taking the battle to them, rather than attacking lone hunting parties, Great One, the Warlock replied, a little surprised at his own daring. Kil'jaeden cocked his horned red head, considered, then nodded. True, and there is yet time. It had been several days since the fall of Telmor. Gul'dan, impressed with the job Durotan had done, had tried to give the city to the Frostwolf clan as a reward, but Durotan had declined the offer. The Frostwolves, he stated, would continue to live in their ancestral lands. The Blackrocks, however, had not been so foolish. Blackhand and his family now slept in the beds where the Magister of the city had once slept. At first, the orcs had not known what to make of the trappings of the Draenei, but now they were beginning to incorporate their victims' way of life into their own. They sat in chairs, ate at tables, analyzed and trained with Draenei weaponry, adapted the armor for bulkier orcish frames. Some of the females, and not a few of the males, of the Blackrock clan had taken to wearing Draenei clothing, incorporating it with traditional orcish tunics, robes, and breeches. Gul'dan knew that many wondered why he or Ner'zhul had not taken the city for themselves. It was tempting, but Gul'dan had been well advised by his master. Creature comforts were pleasant, but power was sweeter, and the less Gul'dan claimed for himself publicly, the greater his reach would be in secret. Kil'jaeden would not let him down, as long as Gul'dan did his master's work well. A few items were brought to his new place he called home. An enormous, circular table carved of wood, inlaid with softly glowing shells and stones, along with several beautiful chairs. Gul'dan stepped forward to the massive table, running his hands over the polished surface, smiling to himself. All that remained was to summon those who Gul'dan had reason to believe would answer. Some names were immediately obvious to him. Others came only with extended thought. But he had a list of names now that was long enough to be comprehensive, should enough to be managed. Soon, sooner than he had even hoped, the Shadow Council would form. While on the outside, Gul'dan was advancing the orcs as a race, giving them power and eliminating the enemy that was the Draenei. A handful of orcs, almost as corrupt and power-hungry as he, would pull the strings. It was not about the orcs as a race. It had never been about the orcs as a race. It was about power, getting it, wielding it, and keeping it. Ner'zhul had never understood that. He liked the power, but was not willing to feed it the meat it craved. Deceit, lies, manipulation, even Blackhand, who thought he was initiated into Gul'dan's ultimate schemes, hadn't grasped the vastness of Gul'dan's ambitions. It was as huge as Kil'jaeden's desire to destroy the Draenei. It was as enormous as the sky, as deep as the oceans, and knife-sharp as hunger. Gul'dan looked at Ner'zhul with contempt, as the older orc, who had once been a mentor, sat huddled in a corner. His gaze traveled to the blazing eyes of Kil'jaeden, and the great being nodded. "Summon them," Kil'jaeden said, his lips parted in a smile, showing sharp white teeth. "They will come when you call, and they will dance to your tune. I will see to that. Allies. They needed allies." Gul'dan wondered how Kil'jaeden had not foreseen this. The orcs were mighty indeed, especially when controlled and directed properly. The long months, over a year now, that this war had stretched had only made them more so. Their best brains had gotten to work on understanding the technology of the Draenei as best they could. Building had begun on the center fortress, which Gul'dan called the Citadel, where a standing army could be conveniently quartered, trained, and equipped. The orcs had never before attempted anything like this, and Gul'dan was proud that he had suggested the idea. There were warriors. There were shaman. Now, of course, warlocks. There were healers. There were craftsmen. The first three had clear roles and no lack of opportunity to perform their duties. The craftsmen were contributing on a different level, creating the armor and weapons and buildings to support those who had the glory of slaughtering Draenei until their bodies were sticky with spilled blood. Some would call these laborers a lower class of orc. Privately, Gul'dan felt that way himself, but he was wise enough to know that their work, while hardly glamorous or likely to gain them recognition, was as necessary as a warrior's willingness to kill or a warlock's mastery of curses. Those who provided food, shelter, weapons, the warriors and warlocks, would not get very far without them. So Gul'dan had made a show of praising the craftsmen, the pleasant result being that they were inspired to work harder and continually improve. But even though every member of every clan was working as hard as he could, and Gul'dan had spies in each clan to make certain of it, it was not going to be enough. The taking of Telmor had been surprisingly easy, and the boost to morale was tremendous. But Gul'dan knew that the Horde's victory was largely due to luck. No one in that sheltered city believed for a moment that they would be discovered and overrun in a matter of a few hours. They had thought themselves completely and utterly safe, protected by the magic of the green stone Gul'dan had dubbed Leaf Shadow, which shielded them first from ogre eyes and then from orcish. That easy victory would not be repeated. How would... "Ogres," he said aloud, thoughtfully. He tapped one sharp-nailed finger against his jutting chin. "Ogres." "Absolutely not," cried Blackhand. He dozed the distance between himself and Gul'dan in 2 strides, towering over the smaller orc. It took every ounce of bravado that Gul'dan had not to retreat from that fearsome face shoved to within inches of his. "Come now, Blackhand," Gul'dan soothed. "Calm yourself and listen to what I am saying. You will be the one to benefit most from this, after all." That got him. Blackhand growled, snorted, and stepped back. Gul'dan did his best not to look obviously relieved. "They are filth," Blackhand grunted. "They have long been enemies of the orcs, longer than the Draenei, and with better reason. How is it that I will benefit?" Getting right to the point, Gul'dan thought with satisfaction. He had judged Blackhand properly. "There are some who still mutter that you were not elected fairly," Gul'dan said. "If you succeed in this, it will only add more glory to your name." Blackhand's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but will the orcs agree to this?" Gul'dan permitted himself a smile. "They will if we tell them to," he replied. Blackhand threw his head back and roared with laughter. Ogrim shifted uneasily in his saddle as he glanced at his leader. When Blackhand had explained what he wanted to do, Ogrim had erupted in protest. He had joined in countless hunting parties over the years to eliminate the ogre threat. More than most orcs, with him it was personal. He had never ceased hating the fact that years ago he had fled from one of the giant, lumbering, thick-skulled creatures. And now Blackhand proposed this. But Ogrim knew that whatever else his leader was, and he was many things that Ogrim did not like, he was a good strategist. The plan was sound if one could detach oneself emotionally from it, so he had agreed to lend his support. Obtaining information had been tricky. The Blackrocks had captured 3 of the ogres, and spent many a long night speaking in sufficiently small words to get their point across before the deceptively pudgy things understood what they wanted and began to cooperate. Now every warrior, warlock, and healer from the entire enormous clan stood prepared for battle. The ogres had told them where the masters lurked and led them to this place, an opening at the foot of the Blade's Edge mountain chain. They had made no attempt to hide themselves. Refuse littered the area outside, and there were plenty of large bare ogre footprints going in and out. Even as Ogrim watched, he saw a small group of ogres trundling out into the daylight. No doubt they thought themselves safe, as Adrenai and Telmor had before them, and no doubt a year ago they would have been right. But much had changed since then. The orcs were no longer groups of scattered clans, but a unified fighting force willing to put aside an old grudge for a new hatred. Blackhand was in front, flanked by the 3 ogres. Behind him were his sons, Rend and Maim, who spoke to one another in low voices punctuated by the occasional rough giggle. Ogrim had been against allowing the boys to fight at first, but they had proven to be stronger and better than one might think. They lacked their father's cunning, but they certainly had inherited his bloodthirst. Griselda, too, had been trained to fight, but she was not a natural the way the boys were. Their names were appropriate. Their father shot them an angry look, and they sobered at once. Ogrim wondered if Blackhand would make a speech. He hoped not. Blackhand was at his best in action, not words, and his clan was more than ready to follow him. To his relief, Blackhand looked over the sea of warriors, nodded once, and then gave the orders to attack. The first wave charged, screaming wildly and pouring down the side of the foothills where they had hidden. At first the ogres were so confused at the sight of 3 of their own allying with the orcs that they simply stood there and let themselves be slaughtered. Then, as their slow brains began to comprehend that they were under attack, they rallied. They still did not attack their fellow ogres, who lumbered through their ranks to talk to the head of the guard stationed somewhere inside Die Cavern. Ogrim was determined to enjoy the last authorized ogre killing he was likely to taste, and swung the Doomhammer with something akin to glee. His wolf was swift, and darted easily between the tree-trunk-thick legs of the ogres who raged impotently and swung his club as fiercely as he could. He recalled how big they had seemed to him as a child. They were still big, but so was he, now, and he wielded a legendary weapon with control and skill. He fractured the shin bone of the ogre, and it roared in agony. Ogrim's wolf danced out of the way as the huge thing fell, making the earth tremble as it landed. It tried to get up, pushing its bulk off the ground with its large, fat hands, but by then other Blackrocks had swarmed upon it. Faster than Ogrim could reckon, the ogre was dead and bleeding from over 24 wounds. Ogrim wheeled just in time to see one of the orcish warriors hurtling through the air, dead from a single blow from an ogre's massive club. Growling, Ogrim gathered himself to charge the murdering creature when a cry of "Hold! Hold!" brought him up short. It was a testament to the power of Blackhand's personality that even now, even when most of the Blackrocks were caught up in the grip of bloodlust and killing an ancient enemy, they stayed their hands. The ogres didn't, at least not at once, and Ogrim found himself riding away from the battle until the slow ogre brains understood what was going on. The thought galled him. "It is for the good of all of us, Ogrim," he told himself. He glanced over to see the ogres the Blackrocks had befriended talking to their kind, or rather, bellowing at them and occasionally smacking them. But at least the ogres had been distracted from following the retreating orcs and appeared to be listening. One of them, bigger and wearing something that looked like an official sash of some sort, actually seemed to have a brain. Ogrim could not understand the vile things, and used the pause to catch his breath and gulp some water. "Can't wait till we can kill them again," Ren said. Ogrim glanced at his chieftain's eldest son. "If we succeed, they'll be fighting alongside us," Ogrim replied. "You won't be allowed to kill them." Maim spat. "Heh, right. Kill them on the sly." Ogrim grimaced. He himself would like nothing better, but several are dead already, trying to make this plan of your father's work. He wouldn't like you undermining his efforts. Ren sneered at him. Who is going to tell him? "I will. If this works, and they listen to us, if any of them turn up dead, yours are the first names I'll mention." Ren glowered. Right now, he was so young that it looked like a childish petulance, but inwardly, Ogrim was touched with foreboding. He had never liked Blackhand, and liked his children, with the exception of little Griselda, even less. He did not know if it was their parentage or their forced growth that was responsible, but there was a darkness in them that Ogrim mistrusted. One day, if they survived and began using their brains in addition to their powerful muscles, Rend and Mame would grow up to be even more dangerous and deadly than their father. I told you he wouldn't listen, Rend, Mame said petulantly. Old man's forgotten what it's like to have a bloodlust running through him. Let's go. With a final sneer, Rend followed his brother. Ogrim sighed. He had bigger problems than two upstart youngsters right now. He turned his attention back to the negotiations, although he doubted the ogres would have understood a word. The attacks appeared to have stopped. Blackhand, who fled the battlefield as he had told all his clan to do, now directed his wolf down to where the ogres were gathered. Ogrim rode to his chieftain's side, arriving just in time to hear the leader of the guards announce, "We no like Gron. Gron hurt us." He beckoned to one of the other ogres, who turned to show his back to Ogrim and Blackhand. Ogrim saw that there were scars crisscrossing the ogre's back. He felt no twinge of pity for the creature. They had done worse to the orcs for decades. Still, it was useful to know. The captured ogres had also spoken of such things, and now they nodded as if they were terribly wise. "What will you give us if we join you?" demanded the guard. Blackhand grinned up at the thing. "Well, for one thing, we won't beat you." Ogrim thought of Blackhand's own sons, but said nothing. "We'll see to it that you're fed, and are given appropriate weapons." Ogrim was relieved that Blackhand hadn't promised armor. 3 orcs could be armored out of the materials that would protect a single ogre, and fortunately, the guard, obviously one of the more intelligent of the ogres, still wasn't smart enough to think of armor himself. "You'll have food, and shelter, and the delight of smashing Draenei to small wet stains on the grass." The other ogres had been listening intently, and now one of them literally jumped up and down with delight. "Me smash," it roared gleefully, and several others took up the simple but apparently highly entertaining phrase. Blackhand waited for their enthusiasm to die down before continuing. "So, are we agreed?" The ogre captain nodded. "No more hurting of ogres," he growled, then turned to regard those he led. His tiny eyes were shiny with tears, and this time, as he looked upon the ogres whose backs were crawling with scars, Ogrim did feel a little sorry for them, a very little. "What is your name?" Ogrim asked the captain suddenly. It shifted his gaze to him. "Kroll," he said. "Kroll, then," said Blackhand quickly before his second could say more. "When do you think we should lead our combined assault?" "Now," Kroll said, and before either Ogrim or Blackhand could protest, he bellowed something in his hideous native tongue. The other ogres jumped up and down, and they shook the earth as they landed. Then they all turned and purposefully re-entered the cave mouth. Blackhand casted a glance over at Ogrim, who shrugged. He suspected it was easier to stop the tide than this flood of stupid, single-minded giants. "Call them," Blackhand said. Ogrim produced a cleft-hoof single horn and blew on it. The orcs cried out in delight and began to again descend in response. There was no time to remind the Blackrock clan of the plan. Ogrim hoped that they would remember it, especially the overzealous Mame and Rend. Slaughter of ogres aplenty awaited them, but they had damned well better be killing the right ogres. Because if they didn't, if they gave the ogres any reason to question this sudden and very peculiar alliance, then the babes and old males and females who awaited word at the encampment might be all that remained of the Blackrock clan. Ogrim was not optimistic. The Blackrock clan had ever been fierce in the hunt. Blackhand was a little more than a cunning savage, and Ogrim had not failed to observe that recently a sort of manic fury had begun to creep through all the clans. As he whirled his wolf around to charge into the cave with his fellow clan members, he wondered if perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him. Surely the greenish tinge on the skins of the orcs next to him was nothing more than a trick of the light. Chapter 17. Home. Whatever race you are, it is a word, a concept, that makes the heart swell with longing. Home can be ancient ancestral lands, or a new place that one has made one's home. Home can even be found in the eyes of the beloved. But we all need it, yearn for it, know that without a home, of some sort, we are incomplete. For many years, each clan had its own home, its own sacred lands, its own spirit of earth, air, water, fire, and spirit of the wilds. The uprooting began and continued, each more shattering than the last, until we came to Kalimdor. Here, I found a home for wandering people, a place of rest and sanctuary, where we could regroup and rebuild. Home for me is now named for my father, the land of Durotar. Durotan lifted his head and sniffed the wind. The scent that filled his nostrils was one of dust and desiccation, a foul and acrid sort of odor. Not the smell of something burning, not quite, but similar. Once, Drekthar would have been able to catch the scent even better than he, but those days had passed. He was no longer a shaman, but a warlock. The air would not waft to him when asked, bearing information as detailed as if it had been written on a piece of parchment. And worse, Drekthar, along with the other warlocks of the Frostwolf clan, did not particularly seem to care. There had been no rain for some time now, and the summer seemed hotter than usual. It was the second summer in a row that rains had come scantily, if at all, and on a whim, Durotan knelt and dug his fingers into the soil. Once, it had been fertile loam, dark brown and emitting a rich, earthly scent. Now, his fingers plunged easily into the dust. Its crust crumbled beneath his fingers, yielding instantly to dissolve into sand that would not hold grasses or crops, would not hold anything. It sifted through his fingers like water. He sensed Draka's approach, but did not turn around. Her arm slipped about his waist from behind, and she pressed against him. They stood like that for a long moment. Then with a final squeeze, she released him and stepped around to face him. Durotan dusted off his hands. "We have never relied that much on what we could grow anyway," he said quietly. Draka regarded him with her dark, knowing eyes. His heart ached to look at her. In so many ways, she was better than he. But she was the mate of the chieftain, not the chieftain, and she did not have to make the choices he did. The choices he had. "We have depended on what we could hunt, mostly," Draka said. "But the animals we hunt survive on what the earth provides. We are all connected. The shaman knew that." She fell silent as one of the younger warlocks hurried by, a small capering thing at its heels. As they passed, the little thing turned to look at Draka and smiled, showing a mouth crammed full of pointed teeth. Draka could not suppress a shudder. Durotan sighed and handed her a scroll. "I just received this. We must all prepare for a long march. We are to leave our lands." "What?" "Blackhand's orders. He has relocated to his new citadel that has been made for him, and he wants his army there. It is no longer enough for us to join together to attack. We must all live together and be ready to follow where Blackhand leads us." Draka stared up at him incredulously. Then her eyes dropped to the scroll. She read it quickly, then re-rolled it and handed it to him. "We had best prepare," she said quietly, then turned and strode back to their tent. He watched her go, and wondered exactly what it was that made his heart break at the sight. The citadel was incomplete, but the moment it came into Durotan's sight, he was stopped dead in his tracks. Beside him, there were several odd murmurs. So powerful, so big, worthy of a war chief. Had Durotan spoken, he would have said, "Blasphemous, a blight upon the land, out of harmony with everything we are." The traveling Frostwolf clan was still many leagues distant, but the citadel perched upon the horizon like a buzzard. There was nothing in its design that bespoke orcish building. This structure, this architectural nightmare, this offense to eye and spirit was larger even than the Draenei buildings. Of course, Durotan knew its purpose, and it would have to be enormous if it were to constantly house an elite force of orcish warriors. Still, he had expected something else. Instead of the smooth, sleek lines that marked the structures of the Draenei, this fortress was sharp and jagged. Instead of coexisting with the landscape, it dominated it. Hewn from black stone and jagged wood and metal, it fairly bristled against the sky. Durotan knew that he could see only the main tower from here, but that was enough. He stood as if rooted to the spot, reluctant to take a single step closer to the monstrosity. A silent look passed between him and Draka. Were they the only ones left who saw? The rest of the Frostwolves moved forward, passing their chieftain. Reluctantly, Durotan squeezed his mount and continued. Proximity to the fortress did nothing to make it seem more attractive. Now Durotan could see other buildings, barracks, storage silos, a flat expanse of training areas that were crowded with large weapons he had never seen before. They too looked dark and dangerous and deadly. Officious members of the Blackrock clan and others greeted Durotan perfunctorily and sent the Frostwolves to a flat area in the western part of the complex to begin setting up tents. It was heading on toward dusk when Durotan received the summons to report to the courtyard of the citadel, along with several other members of his clan. The group of about 20 walked the distance and waited. He heard the drums first in the distance. Durotan tensed. They had specifically been instructed not to bring any weapons, just to come and wait for. They were not told what. Draka glanced at him uneasily. He had no assurance to offer her. He was as in the dark about what was to unfold as she. The drums came closer. The earth began to vibrate beneath Durotan's feet. Such was not unusual when the drumming started in circle, but so far away. He heard other concerned murmurings, and knew that he was not the only one with a twinge of apprehension. The earth continued to shake, the vibrations growing stronger. 2 Blackrock riders approached, looking exultant. "Do not fear, proud members of the Horde," one of them cried. "Our new allies, brought into our ranks by the mighty Blackhand, are approaching. Welcome them." There was something familiar in the feel of the ground shaking. The only other time Durotan had ever experienced such a thing was when he had been fighting. "Ogres," someone screamed. And indeed, now Durotan could see them. Dozens of them, huge and purposeful, were striding toward the gathered groups of orcs.